Picking up where I left off in the last video, we're going to continue here with this scene and start to activate global illumination, things like that. Before we do that, however, let's just do a test render and see what we have, and let's go ahead and kind of analyze this and see what's going on here. See if anything is right or anything is wrong. Now I still have the render region turned on, so I'm going to switch from region mode to view mode here. Hit render. It's easy to forget simple things like that. It happens all the time. To me, anyway. Okay, so this is what we have so far. Alright, so the models, textures look nice and stuff, but the lighting is horrible right now. We can see we have these huge bright spots and then these very dark areas. So what's going on? Why is this happening? Well, something that's overlooked by a lot of 3D artists is tone mapping. Tone mapping is extremely important because of the nature of how our eyes naturally work and the kind of colors and lighting displayed on camera on monitors. Excuse me. Because of the color range and the lighting that can be displayed on computer monitors or on TV screens and whatnot, we need to do something called tone mapping so that we can fix things so that images like this that appear on our monitor will appear natural and look the way that they would in the real world to our eyes. Okay, now how do we do that? We do that using something called tone mapping. And tone mapping in 3D Studio Max using mental ray is actually very, very easy. You can do it with the click of a few buttons. Okay, so to fix this, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and hit 8 on the keyboard to open up the environment and effects window here. Okay, and you'll see here we have something called exposure control. That's the tone mapping right there. By default, you're not using any exposure control in 3ds Max. So we're going to go here to the drop down list. Now we have quite a few options. Some of these do not work with mental ray. Now the one that does work with mental ray, and the one that I recommend you use all the time, is the MR photographic exposure control. MR, which stands for mental ray. So let's go ahead and select that. Okay. Now it's going to be active and it's going to have some default settings. Let me collapse some of these rollouts here so we can see this a little bit better. So here's our settings for the photographic exposure control. We can select a few presets here based on certain parameters. For example, physically based lighting, outdoor daylight, clear sky. We also have indoor daylight, indoor nighttime, non-physically based lighting, so on and so forth. We're not going to use any presets, however. We're going to go ahead and manually customize and change these settings to fit our scene. So with the default settings right now, I haven't changed anything. It's got the default settings. Let me close that. Let's do another render and see what happens. When it finishes rendering, all we get is a pitch black scene. It appears as though something's not working, something's broken, something is definitely not right. So how can we fix this? Well, let's go back to the environment and effects settings here. And we're going to go to the exposure control and we're going to start to adjust some of these settings, and I'll explain what the settings are that I'm adjusting. Now, up here we have the exposure control settings. That's these parameters from the preset all the way down to the film speed. And if you're familiar with photography and cameras, a lot of these settings will actually be familiar to you. Things like shutter speed, the aperture or f-stop, and the film speed can all be adjusted from here, just like if you were using a camera inside of mental ray. Okay. Then down here we have some extra image control parameters. These parameters control a few extra things to control the look of the shadows, the bright spots, the colors. We can saturate or desaturate and do a few different things. Down here on the physical scale, we have two options. We can use physical units, which is going to be measured in candela per meter squared. We can also use a unitless system that we just control with these arbitrary numbers over here. Okay. We can also come up here to the exposure controls and control this either using photographic exposure, or we can switch to an exposure value. Okay. And we'll take this exposure value. Let's go ahead and let's knock it down to 10. And you'll notice as we change the EV or the exposure value, down here, the shutter speed is actually changing, okay, to adjust itself. So we'll knock this down to an exposure value of 10. The default was 15. We're going to put it to 10. Okay, let's move this to the side here. Let's render out again. And we'll do some test renders while we change these values just to see the effect. You can see it's still coming out dark, but we can start to see something. If you look carefully, you can start to see the window in the background and things like that. Still looks pretty dark though. Let's go down here to our physical scale settings. Let's switch it to unitless. And let's take that 1500, let's reduce it to 1000. And let's render again, see what we get. Now we can start to see our scene. Now the light's coming through and it's looking good. You're also going to notice that those bright, nasty spots from the lights are completely gone now. The lighting looks a lot more natural, a lot nicer, and looks a lot more convincing to our eyes because the lighting is being displayed at a color and a brightness range that looks more natural to the human eye. And this is why we don't have the nasty bright spot over here that looked like an explosive went off. It looks very nice and natural, very subtle, very beautiful. And if we continue to take this value down here that we switch to 1000, say we try something like 500 and render this out again, it's going to look brighter. Editor, you made a mistake. Editor, I made a mistake. Edit that out of the video. Render this out again. There is like crap in my throat, taking me hostage, taking my voice hostage. Okay. Start again in 3, 2, 1. Alright, so this is looking, it's actually looking pretty good right now. Now let's go ahead and let's look at some of these image control settings. We have a highlights, which is a burn parameter, and this parameter controls the highlights of our scene here. So right now it's set to a default of 0.25. Let's go ahead and let's increase this to say 1. And just dramatically change that setting there and render again. And what this is going to do, it's going to take the bright spots, the parts that are burned on the image, and it's actually going to brighten them up even more. So you can see that the bright areas have gotten a lot brighter now. They're a lot more brighter than they were before. Let's drop this back down to about 0.2. We also have a midtones here. The midtones is going to control, obviously as the name states, the midtone range of the image. So if we take the midtones here, for example, and we reduce that to say half of that, 0.5, and we render this out again, we're going to end up with a darker image simply because the midtone lighting in our scene has just dropped. The colors have just dropped to half of what it was before, which is going to make it obviously darker. Now the shadows here we can control as well. The shadows parameter is going to control, as the name suggests, shadows of the scene. Let's go ahead and render it before we change the shadow parameters. You can see how the shadows look right now. Okay, this is the way they look. They're pretty dark. If we wanted to, we could take the shadows parameter and say increase it. Let's just do something dramatic like a setting of 1, just to see the major difference here. And we're not going to get too much of a difference simply because they're shadows. You can only make them so bright. So they're actually not going to increase too much in brightness here. So if we were to say take this down to 0, the shadows are actually going to come out darker. A little bit more pronounced. You can see down back here, these shadows are basically pitch black right now. Look at the cushion over here on the couch. Shadow's actually pretty dark right there. Okay, let me actually go ahead and knock this or increase this back to 0.2 where it was before. If we want to, we can come back and increase the highlights or burn later. I'm going to go ahead and leave it alone like that right now. The white point is just going to control the whiteness of the image. Right now it's set to 6500, which is a setting of D65. If I were to go ahead and change this setting, say to something like, let's just try for the fun of it 1200 here, and we'll render this out again. You notice that now everything just turns blue, simply because our white level has been totally adjusted here, completely changed. So if you wanted to, you could do this, which obviously doesn't look realistic at all. I'm going to keep it at the default setting of 6500, since that's the setting of white, which is going to be neutral. We can also add some vignetting over here. Now vignetting right now is turned off. It's set to 0. Let's go ahead and render without vignetting. And you notice the way it looks. This is the normal, standard way it's supposed to look. Okay. Now let's go ahead and add some vignetting. So let's just crank this up pretty high. Let's just go kind of crazy with this. We'll go to 25. 25 is the highest it lets us go up to. And we'll render this out again. And now you're going to notice that we're going to get darkness on the edges, on the outer rims of the image. And this is a pretty neat effect that you may have seen in movies, TV shows, music videos, all kinds of different mediums use this vignetting little technique here. It's just an added effect that just adds this darkness around the edges of the image here. And there's actually next gen games nowadays that support this vignetting. Some games out there actually support the feature, which adds to the ambiance and the environment feel of the game. So the option is there for you. I'm going to turn it off because it's not very realistic. Okay, so let's just go ahead and end this photographic exposure control section here. I think I went over these settings pretty in depth, and you get the idea of how these work. So let's go ahead and let's close this. And what we're going to do now is go ahead and just turn on global illumination, just to get these dark areas more brightened up and make the lighting in the scene look more natural. So let's go to the render setup window here. Let's go to indirect illumination. And under caustics and global illumination, I want to just activate global illumination. I'm going to leave the default settings. Okay. Alright. By turning on global illumination by default, if you remember, we're using the automatic settings. So without changing anything in the scene and just using the automatic settings of global illumination, let's go ahead and let's do a test render and see what we end up with. Alright. Now, probably the first thing that you're going to notice is that we get this error message from mental ray. It says no photons stored after emitting, what is that, about 100,000, 1 million photons from light, F direct 01 light. Okay, canceling emission job. So global illumination failed. Let's go ahead and hit clear and close this window. You also notice that our scene here came out completely white. So let's close that. What in the world happened? What went wrong? Well, if you remember, earlier I spoke about how this sunlight up here shouldn't have photons turned on. It shouldn't be emitting global illumination. That's what's causing the problem here. Because of the directional light here, it's messing up. Because this is a directional light and it shoots parallel light rays, it's messing up the photon emission from mental ray. So how do we fix this? Well, what we need to do is go to its modify panel, go down to the mental ray indirect illumination parameter rollout, and turn off the global illumination photons. Just turn it off, uncheck it, and it'll be deactivated, and there you go. Okay, so now let's go back into our scene here, and let's try rendering again. And let's see if mental ray complains this time, or if any errors pop up. Okay, so it rendered out, and we didn't get an error. But we're still getting a scene that comes out completely white, which is obviously wrong. So what's going on? Why is that happening? Well, that's because the brightness of the photons is set for these lights. So what I would need to do is go to these lights and take this energy value and drop it. Or what I can do is go to the render setup window. I'll go to the global illumination section, and you see how we have the multiplier setting here? We can actually drop this multiplier to something pretty low, like let's say 0.1. And then we can come back here and we can render this out again. And it still might come out a little bit bright. And yes, it's still so bright that we still can't see anything. That's why everything is rendering out white. So it's not really an error. It's more the settings are wrong. So let me put this back to the default value of 1. So how can we fix this? Well, we can fix it using the automatic settings. If we keep tweaking those energy multiplier values lower and lower, we'll eventually get a pretty good result. But that's not what I want to do. I want to teach you how to manually adjust these parameters here. How to manually go ahead and control these lights. That way you learn the automatic mode as well as the manual mode, and you get the most knowledge possible. So we have 3 area lights here that are emitting photons into our scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to these area lights one by one, and I'm going to change their settings. Okay, I'll start off with this light over here. I'm going to change it from automatic mode, and now you see that the manual settings become active. So I'll turn on manual settings here. What I want to do is be in control of this manually. I don't want mental ray to control this stuff automatically. I want to control it myself. Now let me go to these other lights over here, and I'm going to turn off their global illumination just by unchecking the automatic mode, and that's it. That way I'm just going to have this one light shooting photons in my scene. So only this light's going to have the manual mode turned on. All the other ones are turned off. Okay, so I can see my default energy is set to 50,000. That's pretty high for this scene, so I'm going to have to lower it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to knock it down to about half of that value. So let's go to something like, we can go, let's not go to 25,000, let's go to 24,000. So we're going to knock this down pretty low. We're not going to worry about the caustic photons parameter here because we're not dealing with caustics. Now the decay, I'm going to leave it at 2.0. That way it's using inverse square decay, which is physically correct. That's very important. Now the GI photons parameter here controls the number of photons being emitted by this light. Now in the end, when we do a final render, we're going to need millions of photons here. For now, for testing purposes, we'll keep it at about 10,000 just so that it renders out much faster. But of course we can increase that later anyway. So the main parameter here is the intensity. I'm trying to control the intensity of this light. So let's go ahead and do a test render here. And only one light's going to be firing out global illumination. There we go, beautiful. Now we can see the global illumination in our scene. Let's render out from back here just so we can see the scene a little bit better. Get a better angle here of this scene. And there we go, beautiful. And it's rendering extremely fast. But you can see the quality is very bad. But that's okay, we're just doing preview renders. So you can see the global illumination in the scene. The shadows and things are no longer dark. Now we're getting some bounce lighting, some indirect illumination, which looks very realistic and very nice. Okay? Alright, so now we got that done. Let's go ahead and increase the number of photons here to about 100,000. Okay? So we get ourselves a little bit of a better result. The render is going to take a little bit longer, but not too much longer. The photon emission is actually pretty fast, as you can see. Just takes maybe a second or two longer. And you can see a lot of the artifacting already went away just by increasing our photons from 10,000 to 100,000. Okay, so this is looking up pretty good. So now I realize that, okay, my energy setting of 24,000 looks pretty good. So I should use similar settings, if not the same exact settings, for the rest of my lights. All right, perfect. So let me go ahead and close that. Now let's go to these other lights and make changes over here as well. Now, because this light and this light over here are so close to each other, I'm going to follow the same rule that I did before. Earlier, I changed their intensity multipliers and I made them a little bit lower simply because these lights are so close to each other and they're going to create a very bright spot in this area. So in order to counter that brightness, I'm going to have to lower the brightness of the photons here. So I'm going to turn on manual mode. I'm going to take the energy, and instead of doing 24,000 from the other light, I'm going to make it a little bit darker. I'm going to go with 20,000. Okay? And I'll take the number of photons, make that 100,000. Be careful there. It's very easy to accidentally put an extra zero and make that 1,000,000 instead of 100,000. I'll turn on manual mode for this other light, make this one 20,000. And give it 100,000 photons. Okay, now let's go back inside the scene here and let's render out, say, from this angle here, and we should get ourselves a pretty nice satisfactory render. So this is looking pretty good. Now we can see that there's a strange artifact back here in the background, and that's being caused by the background object. Let's just zoom out here for a moment, and we have this big box cube object around our scene. Let's right click on top of it after selecting it and go to object properties and take off the display as box parameter here and hit OK. It's basically just a giant sphere with a white constant shader around our scene. So what we're going to do is let's take that object and let's use the scale tool and just scale that up, make that pretty big to take up more of our scene there. Okay, that should fix that problem right there. Let's just go back here and render this out again. Okay, so there's a little problem solved there. So this global illumination is actually looking very beautiful. It's making our scene look simply fantastic. And the tone mapping from the mental ray photographic exposure shader is just adding a beautiful touch to the scene. Okay, so let me close this render out. Let me come over here and I'm going to render close to the floor right about here's pretty good. Let's do a test render there. Just want to see something and point something out to you very quickly here. Okay, so if you have a really close look at this, you're going to notice that there's something wrong with the render. Okay, it might be a little bit hard to put your finger on it, but there's something wrong. everything just looks a little bit washed out. Everything looks a little bit pale and just a bit washed out, which is obviously not good. So what's happening? Why does this thing look washed out and it doesn't look too great? Well, that's because of gamma correction. Okay, let's go to the rendering menu here and open up the environment and effects window, or hit 8 on the keyboard, which is a lot faster. Okay, let's go down here in exposure control. Down here, what you're going to see is something that says gamma and LUT settings. Okay, now it's going to say gamma is disabled. We recommend turning it on. Let's hit the setup button here, and you can see here that we can enable gamma. So we can enable gamma correction. It's actually pretty important. Okay, we're going to turn that on, and we're going to go down here and make sure that gamma is selected. Now these are default settings. It should be set to 1.8, and then you have a setting over here for bitmap files and one over here for materials and colors. We don't really, we're not going to mind these materials and colors over here. That's not important. What is important, however, is the gamma here, as well as the bitmap file parameters. So let's just use this default settings, hit OK, and you notice that the image becomes a lot brighter here because we have extra gamma correction. Now we want to be careful because when we're using the photographic exposure control, we're already applying tone mapping. So by adding more gamma correction, we're actually going to, basically, we're applying double the gamma correction, which is not a good thing. So we can actually come in here and you can change this gamma correction, say to 1, hit OK, and it's going to go back to basically turning that off. Now let's go back to setup here. There's a very important parameter here, and that is the bitmap file parameters. Okay, when you're bringing in images to the 3ds Max or any 3D package, okay, images, textures that were made in a 2D editing program like Painter, Photoshop, or anything like that, these images are going to be in different formats. You've got Targa, you've got JPEG, you've got bitmap, you've got PNG, and all kinds of different formats. You also have high dynamic range formats, image formats like OpenEXR and HDR images. These are the kind of images that are high dynamic range. These are floating point images. They're very high depth images. But when it comes to images like JPEGs, which make up all the textures in the scene, the textures in the scene are JPEG images. That means they're low depth. Okay, that means they're 8-bit files. These files have to be gamma corrected the correct way, or else they won't be interpreted correctly by 3ds Max and Mental Ray. That's why these textures look pale and they look washed out. For example, the texture here on the floor. Alright, so what I need to do is I need to change this input gamma of the bitmap files. So it's going to change my any images here, any bitmap files like the JPEGs in the scene are right now using an input gamma of 1.0. That's actually incorrect. What we need to do is switch that to 2.2. A gamma curve of 2.2 is going to go ahead and gamma correct the textures, not the render, but the textures. So with that done, let's go ahead and hit OK. Now you notice that nothing happens. That's because for the change to take effect, we have to re-render the scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clone this render just to keep it, and then I'm going to render this out again with the new gamma correction settings. Now the first thing you notice is that it renders out extremely dark, okay? But if you look carefully, the textures now are more saturated, more rich in color, and more detailed. They're rendering out correctly. The problem is everything's rendering out dark. So how do we fix this? Well, it's pretty simple. Let's go back to setup. And now that the input gamma has been corrected to a gamma curve of 2.2 for the JPEG images or the low depth images in the scene that create the textures, now we have to go and take this gamma and increase it to 2.2. So now we're going to go ahead and properly gamma correct the render. So let's hit OK. And now we go back to the way that it looked like before we even turned on gamma correction. Now, the changes are very subtle. It's very difficult to tell. This looks just like the way it looked before we did any of this gamma correction stuff. But if we open up the image from before, okay, here on the right is the image from before. This is the image with the incorrect gamma curve applied to the JPEG textures in this scene. Very washed out, very pale, looks horrible, looks disgusting. And here's the new render on the left. The new render on the left looks pretty bright too, but it's not washed out. It looks realistic, and the images, the textures here are actually being rendered out to the correct color range, okay? Because we went ahead and we applied the correct gamma correction profile to these textures, to our bitmap images in 3ds Max in this particular scene. So that's a huge difference, and this is actually very, very important. That's overlooked by a lot of 3D artists. You have to make sure you pay attention to this kind of thing because it makes a huge difference and can make or break your render. Okay, so there we go. That's how to properly gamma correct an image here in 3ds Max using the gamma preference settings here. All right, so let's go ahead and close this. This is good to go. All right, so that's going to do it for this video. We covered a lot of stuff here. In terms of gamma correction, photographic exposure control, and tone mapping, and activating our global illumination settings and all that stuff. So this video has been running for a pretty long time. I'm going to end it here, and in the next one, we're going to continue to work with this scene here and see if we can wrap it up and finish it up and get ourselves a really nice final render.